Michael, let's get started. We're gonna have Richard today, but he's about to to arrive here. But let's get started with Michael. Michael, how do you find this Russian plan for cryptocurrency in order to facilitate BRICS trade?
Well, I I think it began being talked about already a year ago. At the beginning, certainly of 2024, is the unit, and it was developed as a kind of Bitcoin plan, very anti-government. They said the whole purpose of this is that it's non-political and it's hard money. It's just like gold. It's not, governments will have no role to play in this at all. And basically, it's going to be for investors, private investors, corporate investors, basically to save. What they didn't say is who's going to get this money? Who's managing the fund? The indication is a group of private investors have already bought a whole group of Russian bitcoins or crypto coins, and they want to get other people to jump in and begin buying them. And it's promoted by the most recent Russian press releases is this is going to be a crypto way of getting around the American sanctions against imports and trade and investment in Russia. But all of the promotion is this is going to be a way to make money. And this Russian coin is going to be based ostensibly on gold, on Russian currency, Chinese currency, and BRICS currencies. But suppose that you pay money and you buy the Russian Bitcoin. How is this money going to be invested? Is it going to be like Sam Bankman-Fried, and they can invest it in anything they want? Or is it going to be run by the Russian central bank? And the Russian central bank will either convert this money into rubles or will use this money to do what it's supposed to do, to buy gold and to buy these other currencies, to buy Chinese currency and BRICS currencies. There's no indication at all of who's going to manage it, whether it's going to be able to go up and down. It's supposed to be based on gold and currencies, but so are stable coins, and the stable coins and the bitcoins are going way up relative to these prices. Are people going to somehow make this into an investment vehicle? And if that's the case, and it's set by the open market, then how is this going to create stability for the governments that are using it? In the first version of this Russian stablecoin, the unit, they said this is we're following this from von Mises and Hayek and Mundell. We hate governments. The governments will have no role to play. Only we will have a role to play. And because it's crypto, we don't have any idea of what's happening. So suppose that you're an exporter to Russia and you want to get around the American sanctions, European sanctions. You'll buy cryptcoins and send your ship to Russia, and apparently nobody's going to know about this or follow it. And that's pretty easy. But suppose that Russia buys something from you that is sanctioned. Okay, you're going to get a payment in this cryptocurrency. How are you going to convert this into American dollars? If the markets for these are in St. Petersburg and Moscow, then how, given the sanctions against dollars and convertibility, how are you going to get your dollars out of St. Petersburg and Moscow? Is there going to be some around process, or are there going to be other cryptocoin markets in the West, in America and Europe, maybe in Asia somewhere? None of this really makes sense. How if you're converting money from crypto, Russian crypto, into dollars, there has to be a record of it in your balance sheet. The corporations have to publish. Are they going to have in their assets and liabilities, if they have, we have this much money in cryptocurrency is our capital gap backing, maybe somebody from the FBI will look at it and say, "Wait a minute, this cryptocurrency is only used to evade controls with Russia and to do something illegal. Can you tell us just about what that transaction is?" Maybe we'll come in and could we take your computers and look over and see what's happening here. None of this makes sense on the surface. And when something doesn't make sense on the surface, there's usually a good reason why the designers of this currency don't want it to make sense on the purpose. So we can look at the details of what they say. They say it's to facilitate BRICS trade. Well, again, trade channels, they say the key highlight is that it's the gateway for the BRICS trade. But again, who owns and manages this new currency? Will it only be government officials that manage it? Or what I suspect is private individuals who set up this fund on a consignment from the government, acting on their own, and the government has to leave the management to these non-government officials. I would be surprised if Russia's central bank is actually managing it. And if it's not managed by the central bank or a Russian government authority, then somebody else must benefit. Are they getting a commission for all of this? What's their commission? Why? And if that's the case, why doesn't Russia just do it itself? Why does Russia need a group of non-governmental, anti-government admirers of free markets to organize something that you'd think normally a government would be doing itself? Just to make sure that there's no Sam Bankman-Fried in there just taking the money for themselves. How is the Russian government's interest protected, and how are the parties who are supposed to be importing and exporting to Russia to handle the translation of their own currency, let's say dollars, into and out of the Russian crypto coins, without the government anti-sanction police coming in and trying to accuse them of whatever law they want to cite in all of this. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to be a government agency. They say the target audience is going to be large, limited initially to large companies, particularly exporters and importers. Well, that's very strange. And then they say to large companies for savings. Well, why would the Russian government want to create a vehicle for other people to save in unless they want the price of the Russian crypto coin to go up relative to other currencies, to be an investment vehicle? And if that's the case, and the price does go up, as apparently the designers want it to be, suppose then Russia owes money in crypto coins for the imports or the contracts that it makes with foreigners, it's going to end up suddenly owing a lot more money in crypto coins than it would have made just in a bilateral deal. Why are these needed? You can't just say, well, they're needed because there's export and import trade with Russia. Okay, but how does this solve that need? Of course, they're just citing all of the things that people want to happen and then saying this is going to solve it all, but they don't say how it's going to solve it all. That's what doesn't make any sense. I'd like to know what Russian agencies are involved, and the fact that no Russian agencies were involved to begin with, and the crypto coin was supposed to be really a Bitcoin with a Russian flavor, sort of like with Russian characteristics, basically, because it traded in Russia. Well, one of the problems if it's traded in the Moscow and St. Petersburg exchange is there going to be a published statement? Here are the crypto coins assets and liabilities. It's got all this money from dollars and speculators, Latin America, Asia, Africa. Those are that liabilities. What are the assets? What are they invested in? Are we going to have a balance sheet of their gold holdings? And we'd like to know the foreign currency holdings. And if they're invested in just what they say, the coin is gold and foreign currencies, then there's not going to be a capital appreciation. But I think what they've done is taken the index that the BRICS countries have talked about. They say, if we're going to deal with balance of payments imbalances between the BRICS countries and each other and China, some countries are going to owe more money than others. They're going to be deficit countries and surplus countries. This is the issue that John Maynard Keynes addressed in 1944 to say, how are we going to create a central bank currency just to denominate intergovernmental assets and debts, so that there can be some standard evaluation for countries that either run a surplus or a balance of payments deficit. The Russian Bitcoin has nothing to do with that, nothing to do with government money. What the BRICS need, what Russia needs and China needs, is some central bank ledger of assets and debts, and the way, like the Keynes Bancor, it was called in 1944. Well, the Americans didn't want Keynes's Bancor because, no, wait a minute, we want hard money. We know that England's in trouble. We want to make sure that we end up absorbing England's empire. So we're not going to let any central bank create this artificial money to lend England the money to get by. They're going to have to depend on dollars. So the Russian plan is really like the U.S. plan that was against Keynes's plan, against the plan to say, well, if America runs a big balance of payment surplus and continues to do it, then after a point, we're going to write down the surplus. We're going to cancel the debts for debtor countries like England, because we don't want to sacrifice debtor England to have to impose depression like it did in the 1920s for the inter-allied debts, and like global South countries are having to do today with their debtors. This is not the aim of what the Bitcoins are created for.
Yeah. Richard, welcome.
Yes, my apologies. In all the back and forth, I didn't remember the 1:45. I left it at 2 on my calendar. My apologies.
No problem at all. Richard, can you address what we were, because if you remember, we were talking about the cryptocurrency plan on the part of Russia to facilitate the BRICS trade. And what's your take on this concept?
Well, in order not to get lost in the weeds, and there in any case, Michael would be a better guide than I am for those sorts of things. For me, I see this as a long-term shift of the world economy. The dominance of the US dollar is being eroded in a variety of ways. It's less important for trade. It's less important for loans. It's less important for investments. For me, that's a complicated process. Different countries have different agendas. Actually, different industries also have different agendas, and they're not the same as their countries. They're all trying to figure out how to adjust basically to the decline of the American empire. And that's going to take a while. It always has with every other empire. It's an adjustment process, trying to figure out how to emerge from this change in as good or better shape than you went into it. And that takes time to figure out. And each country's decision, now that there's more of a world economy than we've had before, each country's decision changes the parameters for every other country. So you have one of these dynamic adjustments in which everything is an adjustment to an adjustment to an adjustment. And to foretell how that's going to work, it's literally impossible. Too many variables. You can't do that. So I think you stay best with the big picture. The Russians have, for example, several conflicting, or at least not identical interests. They need to fund the war. They're in the middle of one. They need to support the BRICS as a counterweight to the G7. They need to work carefully their relationship with India and China and other parts of the global south, but particularly India and China. And they need to enhance the power and importance of the ruble. So all of those things are at stake here in how they maneuver, with whom they agree to trade in what currency. Are they going to be in favor of a single currency, a basket of currencies? This is wrapped up with whether we're going to have another empire, the Chinese, or we're going to have a multipolar system that isn't so like what we've had for quite a while in the human race at this point, but which we might now be capable of at least trying to do. All of those things are being played out here, and I don't think we should attach ourselves too much to one or the other. They are meaningful. This is a meaningful act that the Russians are trying to do this. But so was the decision, for example, of Saudi Arabia to accept payment for oil in currencies other than the dollar, having been quite strict beforehand on making it be that was a very important decision. That made possible the rapprochement with Iran. That in turn changed other calculations. That's what I mean, that each adjustment provokes follow-up adjustments in ways you cannot prefigure. It's a kind of path developed economic evolution over time.
I think that Richard has said exactly what the problem to be solved is. And that problem basically requires a central bank for the BRICS countries to make this. It has to be settled by some kind of consensus among the various countries. That's exactly what the Russian proposal does not do. It's the antithesis of what this cryptocurrency is, because it's crypto. And the whole idea of what the central banks need is, how do we deal with the balances that mount up between surplus countries and deficit countries? And if China spends a lot of money on the Belt and Road investment, and the recipients of this investment are going to owe money to China, how are we going to denominate this money and this kind of debt, and what are the terms that it'll be paid that are going to be paid? We're not going to be like the IMF and insist on austerity plans to pay. There has to be an overall government, sort of like a financial United Nations for all this. And the BRICS, the unit coin proposal that Russia's talking about is the exact opposite. It's just a new speculative currency that can be used for trade with Russia or the Russians. And I mean, my question is, who are these Russians? Are they the central bank? Is it a group of consultants to the Russians? Is it a group of Russian scammers who have convinced the Russian government to let us handle it? Everything's going to be okay. We don't know a thing. And when somebody makes a proposal for a new company, especially for a financial initial public offering, you need to know who the people are. Does anybody own these crypto coins already, and have they taken a position in it? And if the price goes up, are they going to benefit, or somehow will Russian central bank be the beneficiary, or else hold the liability if they owe money in these? That's really the issue. That all we can do in this show is to try to convince people to raise these questions and not let themselves be bamboozled by people, promoters who are not answering these questions, and apparently do not want people to know who's managing it and who's getting the money and where's the money being invested.
I want to add one more dimension to this, which is an amazing number of people seem to live, including economists, seem to live in a world that's ahistorical. They don't seem to be aware. I notice that so often. They don't seem to be aware that throughout human history, debts have often been unmanageable by the borrower, who has at a certain point said, that's it, I'm not paying anymore. And then the question is, what happened? But there's no automatic mechanism here. There isn't somebody, there isn't a powerful God in the sky who makes you pay. The question is, will there be a political force that makes you pay? Will there be an economic force that makes you pay? But that's always a question. That's not always a question whose answer is automatic. And if you don't get it right, if you don't understand the old truth that had to be learned by the human race, you keep squeezing the borrower who hasn't paid back, you may eventually produce much greater damage to yourself than you would have had to suffer if you had said, no, thank you, you don't have to pay anymore. Try to remember, for example, that after World War I, France and Germany imposed the reparations on Germany. And it meant that Germany suffered an outflow of money having nothing to do with buying and selling its products, but a debt it had to pay. It had to pay reparations. It's like having borrowed. And the French and the British had this idea. They wanted to have fought a world war they didn't have to pay for, a luxury that very few ever get to really enjoy. They tried. And what did they do? I'm going to make a long and complicated story short, but they produced Adolf Hitler. It made it impossible for Germany to repay. They started repaying in the immediate aftermath of the war, 1918. By 1923, the way they were repaying was by printing money on a scale that the world had never seen. In a short amount of time, you went from half a dozen Deutschmark to the dollar to 5 billion Deutschmark to the dollar, right? That's an inflation. Prices were doubling for months at a time, every few hours in Germany. That's how their inflation actually worked. And what did it do? It went and it decimated the German middle class, which had been accumulating savings for a century in the frugal way that Germans did at that time. And those savings, accumulated over 5 generations for a century, were worth a quarter pound of butter in the matter of 6 months. They were wiped out. What the war didn't destroy, the inflation did. And what the inflation didn't destroy, the Depression of 1929 did. If you subject a modern population to losing a world war, to a mammoth inflation, and to a depression, punctuated by a total inability to repay its debts, you have a prescription for catastrophe. And all you need is a Hitler to ride into power on the basis of that catastrophe. Hitler takes power in January of 1933, which is literally the culmination of these events. And people are very sorry that they didn't forgive the reparations or forget the damn reparations long earlier. It might have, you'll never know, but it might have evolved a different history, different in very, very important ways. And when a Latin American country, I don't know, Chile or Argentina, big borrowers can't pay, it's never the banks that can enforce it. That's the United States and the military who in the end threaten, or the financial community that threatens, you'll never get another loan from us, which, by the way, isn't a very powerful threat, since it's easily countered by saying, right, because we don't pay back the old debts, any new debts you give us will get priority, and so we will continue to get them. It's a game, but it's a game almost like a place of Russian roulette, and it makes the whole borrowing and debting and imbalances be a provocation, but without a clear answer, because the clear answer depends on all the other political and economic conditions within which a loan is taken out, a repayment program described, a repayment program ignored. All of those then become events of their own whose outcome is uncertain.
I'm trying to relate what Richard says to the question. Richard, how Nima began this was to discuss the Russian proposals for this new cryptocurrency. And the connection with what you've said about German reparations, every hyperinflation in history has come from foreign exchange, from owing debts in a currency that you do not produce. The myth of the private enterprise boys is, gee, Russia printed so much money that it caused the currency to decline and created hyperinflation. That's not what happened at all. Russia was burdened with inter-ally debts to pay the Allies so that the Allies could pay their debts to the United States for the arms that they bought before the United States entered World War I. So what Russia did, it sold its own currency, the Deutsche Mark, on the foreign exchange, and to try to buy the dollars and the francs and the British sterling that had to pay these countries to pay the Americans. And as they put the money in the foreign exchange, the foreign exchange plunged, and because the exchange rate plunged, that increased the cost of imports as denominated in German marks. And first you had the decline in the exchange, then the rise in prices, and then finally the money supply was a response to all of these debts. So that's the kind of problem you had. And regarding what are you going to do if a debtor won't pay? Well, we all know who the largest debtor is that's not going to pay, and that's the United States. It's not going to pay the foreign holders of dollars. That is the central banks that hold their monetary reserves in dollars. And if you try to collect, the United States mount a color revolution in their countries. But this really gets off the whole issue of foreign currency. There's no way that a crypto coin is going to solve any of these problems, or that the free market can solve these problems, because it can only be solved by governments. As you say, the governments shouldn't have demanded German reparations or the inter-allied debts that made the reparations necessary. All of these are decisions that have to be made. As you point out, the world's breaking into two different areas, and whatever the BRICS countries are going to do that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this system is going to be something that is negotiated by their governments, not set by private corporations buying a currency in a cryptocurrency in Russian currency exchanges. So I want to focus on just what Nima said, and we're discussing, what really, you pointed out what should be the concern of the Russian government to solve the problem. And instead of any discussion of solving this problem, they've come out with the crypto coin that doesn't have anything to do with the problems that you've just discussed.
Yeah. It's a little surprising. I don't understand. When I read it, I didn't understand why this is happening now. And if you're going to do something that is supposed to be good for BRICS and in this world thing, it can't be done by one country. It can't be done in Russia. What is that? Why are they doing that? They're not even the biggest player in BRICS, not by a long shot. If someone's going to start doing this kind of game, it would be the Chinese, not the Russians. And the Chinese didn't do it and are clearly not part of this. At least what I've read, I don't see them as part of it. So my suspicion is that this is some sort of initiative that, to understand it, you would need to know much more than I do about internal Russian maneuvering and the government there, and that this will fade. That's my guess, that this will fade and be replaced by something that's much more collective and that's much more about settling imbalances among the BRICS people.
Well, you're saying, why are they doing this? Well, my question is, who are the they?
Yeah.
That's what we don't know. I have no idea who they are. I suspect I don't see any sign that it's the Russian central bank. This announcement is not a Russian central bank announcement. It's an announcement by, well, we really don't know who. That's the problem. It's somebody's announcement using Russia's needs to solve the sanction problem is a cover story to all of a sudden find this solution, this cryptocurrency solution that's a solution without a problem. And we think they should talk about the problem you and I are talking about. Yes, the intergovernmental problem of how you're going to create this alternative to the dollar on a global scale. That's not what this is all about. This is how to avoid the problem and avoid governments altogether. It's sort of an anti-BRICS currency.
Yeah. Just let me show something here. Richard and Michael, here we have an article in Reuters reporting that the Russian economy is growing, and we've been talking about this before. And when you look at this conflict in Ukraine, do you think what's in the mind of Washington right now if they knew that the Russian economy is not going down, it's getting better?
Well, let me try to offer an answer. One is short term and the other is long term. The short term answer, and really, and I've tried to think this through over and over, and I don't come up with anything else. The short term answer is the word propaganda in its literal, traditional sense. Endless effort is made by the people who started this war, who connived to generate this war, to blame Russia for being the bad guy here, for causing the war, and to be able to make the argument that the United States' opposition is successful, it is saving Ukraine, it is saving freedom, and it is punishing the bad Russians. And the propaganda line is those things are all happening. And the fact that none of them are happening has now not been a deterrent for at least a year. They just repeat it over and over again. And they do this by hyping whatever the poor Ukrainians, and let's remember, this is a war between the West and the Russia, in which the two sides have agreed to fight to the last Ukrainian. Okay? And I don't mean to be funny because it's awful for what's happening in that country. But that's really what this is all about. It is a pretense by the people who do not want to be responsible for any failure. They do not want to say that the Russians are now have taken over whatever it is, a quarter or a third of the land mass of Ukraine is now under Russian military control. So that's a defeat. They don't want to admit that Russia isn't doing well. That's what this headline from Reuters shows, that their economy has grown faster across this war than it was growing before, which is not a measure of failure and not a measure of the success of the United States. And finally, they have to say that these sanctions work. There was a recent article, we may have discussed it in an earlier program, a recent article either in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal that counted sanctions. The United States is number one in the world. It now has outstanding 15,000 sanctions against governments, industries, individuals. Number two, which may surprise you in the world, is Switzerland with a mere 5,000. But the great enemies of the United States don't do sanctions. So you either have to assume they're too poor, well, that's no longer the reason, or they're too stupid, that's not a reasonable reason, or you might conclude it's because they don't work. And there's a literature, a vast literature, that indicates that sanctions don't work. And by don't work, I mean, A, they are easily, more or less, evadable, avoidable. You get around them in lots of different ways. But number two, and more important, they are politically counterproductive, because the damage you do is to the mass of the people whose leaders explain to them that it's because of the sanctions, even when it isn't. So you're giving your enemy the best possible. That's why you have no change in Cuba. You've had sanctions against Cuba for 60 odd years or 70 odd years, with the attempt to get rid of that regime. Attempt failed. Sanctions failed. Why? Well, in one way, Castro and now his successors are able to say to the Cuban people who have suffered materially from these sanctions, because their ability to evade, being a small island 90 miles off the shore of the United States, is much more limited than other countries in the rest of the world. So they couldn't evade so well. So they've suffered. But it didn't shake the regime, because everybody in Cuba was told 10 times a day, this is because of the sanctions. The Americans are doing that to you, giving every Cuban a personal stake in being angry and opposed to the United States for the damage that the United States did to the education they could give their children, to the lifestyle they could give their family, to what they themselves could do. I mean, it's stupid beyond words. It's really stupid in many of its cases. There are some cases where it can work, but they are limited, and a general policy of doing this is a neoconservative nonsense that they don't want to admit. And so you get this endless placing of stories. This Kursk, the defeated Ukrainian army finds a weak area on the battle line and plunges into Russia, an area that is underdeveloped, everybody knows, doesn't have much in the way of resources, is underdeveloped, doesn't have many cities, is rural, and they can take it for a few days, maybe a few weeks. And now the Russians, predictably, moved their troops, since they have a 2-to-1 troop advantage over Ukraine. They moved their troops around and are pushing the Ukrainians out of this little, but they tried to palm that little game of desperation off as, and Mr. Zelensky announced he's now ready to sit down and bargain with Putin, as if his incursion into Kursk changes anything. But the American media are full of celebrations of the advances made by the Ukrainian military. One really has the feeling one's in another world here. And in the long run, I think what you're seeing is the discovery by the BRICS nations, by Russia, China, and India above all, but the others too, that the United States doesn't have the power it once did, that the name of the game, and I'm going out on a limb here, but I don't want us to shy away from it, that the name of the game here is, for the United States, either you're willing to use nuclear weapons, in which everything changes, or you're not. But if you're not, the rest of all of your maneuver is bluff, and we're not fooled. We know. And you're not gonna threaten us with nuclear war and get us therefore to back off. We are exposing that that's the only card you have, and everything else we can take and we can win. This, and believe me, this is as powerful a change of the world as if somebody had dropped a nuclear weapon.
Well, I think you and I have discussed earlier in this show that sanctions don't work. And I think now the U.S. realizes that, and certainly they're not going to do sanctions beyond what they've done already on China. And I think Nima was talking earlier about how the sanctions that have been imposed recently by the U.S. and Canada and the other allies are mainly against China. And the question is, how are countries like China going to respond to these sanctions? Is that something, are we going to get to discussing that, Nima?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you mentioned before, I think when you were writing us, that the comments on the Bill Riley show saying that the U.S. should concentrate on the war of Ukraine, and the U.S. priority is going to be China. Richard was just talking about the blind
Just
ally.
mentioning that JD Vance, the Trump's pick for the vice president, JD Vance was talking about this on Bill O'Reilly show.
Yeah, and what the United States can do against China is very much different than Russia. But one of the casualties of all this is European relations. So basically, the U.S. is telling America's allies, we're not going to fight against Ukraine because we're going to fight against our main enemy, that's China. And so you're going to have to pay for your own war to support Ukraine. And given the EU's budget deficits of just 3% of GDP, how is Europe going to really fight to support Ukraine in this, while America essentially pulls back? I think it's given up on Ukraine. We're not going to have probably not atomic war there. The U.S. says, okay, we're going to treat Ukraine like we walked out of Afghanistan. Well, perhaps Mr. Blinken will suggest to Europe that there is a way to finance Ukraine. It can simply grab China's foreign exchange reserves in Europe, just like it grabbed Russia's reserves. And maybe it can grab the holdings of Chinese companies there, just as the EU grabbed Russia's resources. And we know now that one of the casualties of the Ukraine war has been that Germany is being plunged into depression. The Financial Times just today said that business sentiment and consumer sentiment is turned down again. They're going to vote in the elections next month in September. They're probably going to vote out of power altogether, the Christian Democrats and the Greens when in the East German elections that are coming up. But none of this sacrifice of Europe has deterred the U.S. bureaucracy and the current political leaders from putting their loyalty to the United States first. And if European voters are not able to prevent them from giving U.S. diplomacy priority over their own national needs, then the United States is going to be free to extend its conflict in China with leaving Europe holding the bag. And it can even now impose sanctions against Europe trading in China, just as it stopped its trade and investment, although it seems that the U.S. is now turning much more to tariffs.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I disagree just a bit with Michael, which is unusual, but let me pursue it. Maybe not. I was struck that Jake Sullivan, the security advisor, is in China, I believe now as we speak.
I thought it was. Oh, you're right. It's Sullivan. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, Sullivan. And I was also struck that apparently there was some sort of telephone call yesterday between Biden and Xi Jinping that was associated with Jake Sullivan's going over there. The ostensible conversation, according to Sullivan's people, was that he was going to persuade China not to support Russia in Ukraine. That's so ridiculous that I'm not going to wait. I'm not interested in that. Nobody in the world is interested in that. They've tried that for years, and that is dead on arrival, if anything ever was. Unless it's just a cover for some sort of proposal or deal that they want to make. And the reason I think that might be, I don't know anything that nobody else doesn't know. I think that you're going to see, I think there's a good chance you're going to see some stark reversals in positioning and policy because what has been going on is such a rollicking failure. I mean, it's a failure upon a failure upon a failure. Look what we just said about Russia and Ukraine. That's a failure. It's a failure. You know, and China has been the butt of tariff war and trade war, at least from Obama, certainly through Trump, continued by Biden, and it was always supposed to change Chinese behavior. I don't see anything. It's a failure. It doesn't work. And even the practitioners in the West watching this, who are not charged with public relations, must on some level. So here comes my guess. You're going to see reversal because underneath the phony unanimity around this last gasp of Western domination, Ukraine, there's been building a domestic hostility to all of this, bitterness, anger, which is now about at a tipping point. I'm going to give you examples. The British election wipes out the Conservative Party. That's sort of interesting. Those people didn't vote Labour. Labour won because it held on to its vote, and the Conservatives left by the millions. If you just look at the last two elections, that's a disgust with all of it, with the corruption of that clown who was the mayor of London. I forget his name, who doesn't comb his hair. That idiot. The end of
Boris
that.
Johnson.
What? Boris Johnson. That's right. The disaster that Brexit has been for Britain. The fact that the working class, their real income has plunged more than that of almost anyone else in Europe for a while now. I mean, it's a walking disaster waiting for finally people to say this is impossible. Then we have Germany. Look at what Michael just said a few moments ago. This is an economy which was the engine of Europe, and now it is the dead corpse of Europe. It is not driving the economy. It's dragging a lackluster European economy even further down. Olaf Scholz is the proprietor of this absurdity, and they're going to vote him out. They're going to vote him out, and it's going to be led by lots and lots of German capitalists who don't want this, who want, once again, to be the Wirtschaftswunder because they got cheap oil and gas from Russia. They want that back. They'll really make Germany great again. In France, you've already seen it. They turned around and said to Mr. Macron, "You're dead." In the first round of the French elections, his party came in third, 20%. 80% of the French electorate voted against Emmanuel Macron, despite his working so hard to be an attractive young man, which, all pissed away, is gone. And I think, my own judgment, they're going to shift gear. We're going to see some big changes. Look at it. The French left is now the unified largest force in the French Assembly. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a name nobody in America knows, just introduced articles of impeachment against Macron, and they may work. Probably not, but they might. I think you're watching. Let me put the icing on the cake. Absolutely, Kamala Harris is the vice president under Biden. She is part of the Democratic Party. She always has been, and so on. What I'm about to say is not about her. She has rescued the Democratic Party from what I thought was a stone cold loser under Mr. Biden. But the only interesting question really about her is not her. Will there be a groundswell from below that she might be willing to work with in a way that a Biden couldn't, and a Trump, that's silly. It might be. The level of militancy rising in the United States is not to be toyed with. The number of strikes, the number of impetuses to slow down the corporate game. I'm noticing that the attempt of the two largest grocery chains in America, Kroger and Albertsons, to combine. Kroger has offered to buy Albertsons, which would make them the third largest retailer after Amazon and Walmart in the United States, saving them from losing their grocery business to Amazon and Walmart, which they have already half done. They're desperately trying to hold up. But these maneuvers of super large corporations are costing a fortune and are driving up prices of food. And that is mobilizing the population in a bitter hostility to all of this. You're seeing tensions, each of which has a particular cause. I get that. And each of which may play itself out without shaking the larger totality. That's also possible. But it is also possible, in a way I did not see in years gone by, that these particulars have the power to shake the whole totality. And if I were a European, my worst worry, my nightmare, would be a deal between between China and the United States to overcome their differences, to compensate themselves for what they have to give up by carving up Europe between them.
Well, I think that I agree completely with the diagnosis of what Richard has said and what should be done. The question is whether it will be done. And there's another interpretation of what may be happening. Nima was mentioning earlier, for instance, that Canada is going to impose a 25% duty on Chinese steel and aluminum exports, just as Donald Trump is proposing a 20% import duty on all of China's imports. Let's suppose for a minute that what Mr. Sullivan is discussing in China is, instead of saying, we admit that the game's over, we admit we made a mistake, what if Sullivan says, we never make a mistake because we're the indispensable nation. We can do whatever we want. So I think, we're just letting you know, we're going to help decouple from you, because that's what we want to do. We're going to do to you what we tried to do to Russia and isolate you, not by sanctions. We know they're not working directly, but we're going to impose tariffs on you. And what do you think of that? Well, here's what I think. If they try that, I think China may say something like the following to Canada, and they can certainly say this to Mr. Sullivan. They could say, well, something very interesting here. If you put a 20% tariff on Chinese exports to the United States, that means that you're making money from our exports. And the more we export to you, the more money the U.S. government raises for itself in the form of tariffs. And the more they import from you, the more the government has this money in its budget to now spend on more military bases all surrounding you, and more money to finance the color revolutions around you. So in effect, American tariffs are a mean to say, let Chinese trade with America finance America's own military spending surrounding China. Well, what can China do for this? It has a number of logical ways to respond. Suppose that it would impose a 40% or 50% export surcharge on sales to the United States, or for U.S. allies who want to simply reroute the exports to the United States. Or they could cut the Gordian knot and simply say, okay, Mr. Sullivan, we realize you say that you're our enemy. You want to decouple our economies, and you want to hurt us by closing off our export markets, like you closed off Russia's markets. Okay, well, we really want to be peaceful with you, so we're going to help you. We ourselves are going to voluntarily cut back our exports to you. You don't have to impose the tariffs. We know that's going to be very hard to get through Congress, because only Congress can levy the tariffs. And we also want to balance the trade. We know that we export more to Europe and to you than you export to us. We overproduce, and that's why we have to export. So we're going to go along with the picture that you're drawing. And I think China, we're just going to cut back our exports. We've already begun last week. We limited our exports of gallium and germanium. We're not going to export them anymore. We're going to use them ourselves. We know that you need these for your military. We know that you need rare earth compounds and computer technology and other items. We know that you need rare earths and gallium and germanium for your computer things. But let's decouple. Well, just imagine what's that? That's China can go along with the U.S. sanctions, sort of like Muhammad Ali, the rope-a-dope. We'll go along to you, and we'll just turn them around and leave you. You go your way, we'll go our way. Give everything away. I mean, I personally would have what I would have liked to see in Sullivan visiting China is China would have simply arrested him and turned him over to the International Court as a war criminal. But the International Court hasn't officially issued any arrest warrants yet. So all it can do is instead of meeting him at the airport, they had him meet with low-ranking officials, and I think they'll just go along with the U.S. It's like a judo. Go along with the U.S. motion, let it play itself out. I don't think the U.S. is anywhere near the nice position that you reality-based position that you're hoping that the world will see as an alternative to atomic war. But I don't think that either Sullivan or Blinken are realistic enough to think that, as you say, that game is over. The United States can't do what it used to anymore. All it can do is make threats. And the strong point of Russia and China is to go along with them. And just like the ending the Russian trade with Europe broke Europe's industrial production that was based on low-priced Russian gas. So the U.S. economy is based on low-priced raw materials and electronics, sophisticated exports from China. And if they try at all to raise import taxes on China as a means of financing America's war budget with these proceeds, China can do to America what's happened to Germany and Europe as a result of America's actions towards Europe. That's what happens if the Americans are too dumb to agree with what Richard says.
Yeah, as I listen to Michael, I realize there's even more evidence for what he is saying, because in many ways, think about China with me for a minute in the following way. 40 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries on this planet. And over the last 40 years, or whether it's 45, it doesn't matter, they have experienced unspeakable economic growth. I mean, just fantastic. Okay? They therefore probably think, as we all would, not only that the efforts of the American government to come over there and suggest they should go some other way are silly, because they've proven that their way is the fastest way to get out of poverty and to become a powerful country. Look what they've done. So nobody would be in a worse reason to listen to such advice. But they might also be understood to have a view very deep in their consciousness now that time is on their side. It's the very nightmare of the American military. It's too dangerous to fight a war now. But the prospects of it being any better next year or 5 or 10 or 15 years from now are even worse. They might be tempted to do stuff now because they can see the same trajectories that I'm outlining here. And the irony may be that the Chinese leadership understands exactly what Michael said. With this addition, they've got to help the United States avoid walking itself into the kind of dead end that might make nuclear weapons a reasonable option for them. They've got to absorb. Look, they've been working for at least the last 10 years to boost domestic consumption so they're less reliant on exports. They've said so. We've seen it. It's visible. They've reduced their dependence on the debt of the United States. They had $1.2 trillion. They now have 700 or 800 billion in U.S. denominated assets. So clearly, they are doing, because those are a conscious act. They are doing things, and they're going to wait us out. They're going to absorb. It's clear, by the way, from a number of studies I looked at, that a number of the tariffs failed because the Chinese lowered the price. So that what happened is they accepted less. So that
Richard, we are having some sort of echo in what you're talking about. It seems that one of the system is just, one of the mics from you or Michael is just getting back. The sound is getting back to me from one of your systems.
Can I talk? No, I see. Yeah, I don't know what that is. I've been using this all day. It hasn't happened.
Michael, can you talk to check it out?
Yeah, what do you want me to say? I mean, I think Richard should be Secretary of State and everything would be much better. But the question is, I think that these guys are locked in to their, it's called hubris. And that's happened to a lot of empires before. And my worry is that when the United States say, we're going down year after year and BRICS are going up, just like Richard says, that leads the neocons to say, well, we'd better bomb them now. Because if we wait till next year, they'll be even stronger to defend themselves. And the year after, they'll be stronger. So if we're going to have the end of the world, let's have it now on our terms. By the way, I have to leave in 5 minutes. So if I may have to turn it off. I have a COVID shot scheduled.
Richard, go ahead. Michael, can you turn off your mic? Just
turn off the mic? Yes. Oh, yes, I'll turn it off when I stop talking.
Okay, turn it off.
I promise to turn it off when I stop talking. I have about 5 minutes left, so I'll listen to what Richard says.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we may be at that point where the Chinese are realizing that one of the things that goes with empire is you really do have to now take a kind of responsibility for everything, because your empire depends on everything. It's the Hegelian other side. You're the big, powerful, but that brings with it levels of responsibility you did not think you had to shoulder. They've had a very good ride for being the exporter to the world. And now they're going to have to absorb some of the difficulties that go with it. But yes, we are having some technical problems. I don't know what that is. You're muted.
Let me turn it on. I think the issue is with your mic, Richard.
Whose mic? Richard's?
Richard's, yeah. Something happening. Right
let me say goodbye now.
Is not connected.
I have to go to the store.
Richard.
And I was talking without Richard before. Now he can go without me. And I'll see you next time.
Okay.
Can you understand me now?
Yeah, it's much better. I think.
Yeah. I think it was the other Michael's
Yeah,
machinery. My
it
point
could
is,
be.
my
Yeah.
point is, in the time that we have left, that China is now so big and growing so fast. It has now conquered almost everything you might want to list for a poor country. It is now a middle income country. It has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, according to the UN. It can compete with the United States at the highest levels of technical sophistication, and in now already in several areas is ahead of the United States. It has shown that it can undertake a 10 or 15-year crash program in research and development, such as the electric car, and come out at the end having done a better job of producing a quality at a price than anybody else could do, which is why there are tariffs against them in the United States and Europe, that they are now at a point of understanding some of the costs that a race to the top wouldn't think about until it got to the top, and then it had to face it. And so when the United States threatens by closing itself off free tariffs so the Chinese cannot unload their exports in the United States the way they were doing for 20 years, they have to make adjustments. And if they hit the United States with an equivalent, that will hurt them possibly more than the United States. And if it doesn't, if it hurts the United States, that might be more dangerous for China. They have to face these realities, which they did not have to face before. It's the problem, in economics. If you're a competitive enterprise and you have lots of other competitors, what you do doesn't affect the market very much. But if there's concentration, if many competitors have become a few and many have died along the way and been absorbed by the winners, and you're now an oligopoly or a monopoly, you have to take into account the whole market in a way you never had to when you were an aspiring small competitive company. It's the irony that what you hoped for when you got it turned out to have a lot of problems you hadn't noticed when you were hoping for it. That's a very Hegelian understanding of the contradiction, and China is becoming the global power that it is, and that's going to mean some costs, and it's going to weigh those costs in a way it did not have to before. And my guess is they got to know it. It's something you learn pretty quickly. The United States learned it at a certain point. So did the Europeans, so did the British in their empire. And my guess is, again, that we may be ready, we may be in for a big surprise. The election outcome in Germany next month, the election outcome in the United States in November. These are very big moments that may involve big shifts in which what was thought to be a minor point of view becomes very dominant very quickly. People should understand. I go back, last thing, to my first example, the British election, which is uninteresting in most ways, but in one way, it's remarkable. The absolute dominance of the conservatives, who blew away one Labour Party leader after another, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but suddenly, not only did they win the election, but they have overwhelming dominance in the parliament. The Conservative Party is simply blown away by a sudden, but if you look at it, it's not so sudden. The vote was sudden, but this had been building up until the control of the Conservatives was destroyed by the Conservatives. They could not hold it together. They had developed ways of behaving that were literally destroying them, and they couldn't stop. They could not stop.
Yeah. Richard, just to wrap up this session, when you look at what J.D. Vance said, he was talking about Europe focusing on the war in Ukraine while the United States is going to confront China. Do you think that the European Union is willing to do that? Because at the end of the day, without the United States putting pressure on the European
cannot.
Union,
Yeah,
how they can
they
continue
cannot.
with this conflict?
It's pure bravado at this point. They cannot pursue that war alone. They never could. They look. They really only went into that war because the United States pushed them and committed to pay for it and committed to provide the weapons. Yes, the Europeans were asked to help, and they have helped, absolutely. But this is an American project from beginning to end, as was the whole expansion of NATO from its original boundaries to the east. No, I don't think the Europeans can do it. But I would also tell you that Mr. Vance, this is a man who wants to disqualify people from holding political office because they did not give birth to children. I mean, for that to become a major idea tells you that they have no solutions to any. They have to make up arguments because there is nothing for them. And Mr. Vance is trying, to the degree that this is serious at all, is trying to figure out how do we handle that Mr. Trump wants to forget the Ukraine war, and that's not going to work with our allies. Well, we're going to have a division of labor is a much more publicity smart way of presenting this than ending the war. Trump just wants to end the war. This looks to his advisors as very stupid. Mr. Vance allows you to be fighting Russia without fighting Russia. So that's his plan.
Yeah.
Not serious. I'm telling you, not. They may go that way, but it's not serious.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Same with me, and my apologies again for doing late. I won't do that again.
No problem at all. See you soon, Richard.
Quê tôi nhớ thuở nào tháng ngày đợi réo neo, con chim kêu chiều chiều nghe vời vời hắt hiu, câu hò sâu lắng ru đời tình nghĩa nặng ơi hò ơi ơi hò. Thương sao khi hạ về nắng lửa đổ khô cây, riêng hai đêm càng dài mưa dầm ngọn héo mây, từng luống đất cay từng ước nguyện người ươm đất niềm yêu đời, bữa cơm vui đất nuôi. Châu mặn mà nghĩa phu thế chớ phụ câu thề. Ai đi không hẹn về sao đậm tình hai quê, bên ni những nguyện thề có chạnh lòng bên tế. Quê người mưa nắng có con tình sâu nặng hay nhạt phai trong lòng. Bên đây chân trời rộng, sức trẻ dài đôi chân, bên đây bao cảnh đời cảm nhận lòng bão dung. Mưa nắng quê người vẫn sâu nặng, niềm tin yêu trong cõi đời tựa sao mãi nơi chân trời. Mặn mà nghĩa phu thế chớ phụ câu thề. Ai đi không hẹn về, sao đậm tình hai quê, bên ni những nguyện thề có chạnh lòng bên tế. Sâu nặng hay nhạt phai trong lòng. Bên đây chân trời rộng, sức trẻ dài đôi chân, bên đây bao cảnh đời cảm nhận lòng bão dung. Mưa nắng quê người vẫn sâu nặng, niềm tin yêu trong cõi đời tựa sao mãi nơi chân trời. Niềm tin yêu trong cõi đời tựa sao mãi nơi chân trời.